That's how this whole mental health community, in my view, is built. It starts at that grassroots level by one person sharing their story with somebody else, who then shares it with somebody else. And suddenly there's a community of people who are open and honest and out there shattering the stigma. And sooner or later, hopefully in my lifetime, these conversations will become the norm, as opposed to, a couple people standing in the side of a room talking about their own struggles, or did you hear about my kids not doing so great? And but people will have that courage to just speak openly and honestly and say, yep, me too.
Welcome to Linda's Corner, where we bring more hope, healing, and happiness to the world. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to be talking about mental health. I'm delighted to welcome Erik DaRosa. Erik is a mental health advocate, speaker, author, podcast host, and the founder and CEO of From Survivor to Thriver. You can reach Erik at his website, and I'll include that link in the show notes. Welcome, Erik. I'm so glad that you could join with me today.
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited. And as you and I were just talking about before we hit record, happy Thanksgiving Eve to you.
Yes, absolutely, which is so awesome. And it's wonderful to have things to be thankful for. And that is actually being grateful is one of the tools that we can use to be happy and to improve our mental health. So I'm sure we'll be talking about that more. When I checked out your website, it says we are changing the face of mental health one conversation at a time. So why do you think it's so important that we have conversations about mental health?
Great question. And yes, it was interesting how that came about. When we launched the podcast, I was on a friend's show. She had a radio show based in the UK. And at the same time, she had a blog where people could anonymously go on and post their stories in a way that allowed them to talk about whatever their lived experience was without having to divulge their name. And she said it was all about, sharing, one story at a time. And she and I got around to talking, and she said, you know what, for you, it's very similar. It's changing the face of mental health one conversation at a time. And it's the reason I started the podcast. It's the reason I do my advocacy work. It's the reason I love coming on other shows. It's to help people. And it's so very important that we have these conversations around mental health, around our struggles, but not only around our struggles, but around things that we've been able to overcome and move through so that other people can feel more comfortable. One, being able to share their story with someone. B, recognizing that they're part of a community, that they're not alone on an island. And that's one of my really big things is, you're not alone. And so when people start to hear these important conversations, it makes it easier for them to feel like they actually have a place in this world and in this community. And whatever they're experiencing, they're not the only ones.
I agree completely. We are not alone. And that is the reason why I do what I do. It's the reason why you do what you do, is to help lift people. We're not just telling sad stories that life stinks, because that's not what I'm about. It is about, you know what? We go through hard things in life. We experience hard things, and we can get through it. And as you listen to other people who have gone through it and have come out, it gives that hope that says, hey, Erik did this. My story feels and resonates with what he experienced. Does that mean that I can do it too? Does that mean that there's happiness out there for me? Does that mean that I don't have to stay stuck in this dark, nasty place forever? And I think just as the more we talk about it, the more we become awake and aware and realize I'm not alone. I can do this. So I think we're on the same page. So far, so good.
We totally are. And I love how you described it. And really what we're trying to do is empower people.
Absolutely.
Each individual person knows his or her story. And it's not about rehashing all of, those years of trauma or whatever else might have we've experienced in our lives, but it's about showing how we've moved through it and how we, by using our own lived experiences, can help empower others, help others find their voices to be strong enough to be able to share their stories so that they too, as you said, can find their own path to healing.
Absolutely. And that's a very important thing, that we get our own power, because even though you have had your success, that doesn't magically lift someone else, but it can give that. It's like lighting a candle, where the candle can light the next candle, but it's still, we got to do the work. And so that's important to know, is we want power within our listeners. We want power within the people that we talk to, so that they can have their own awesome, wonderful, hey, now let me tell you my story of how I overcame, because we want to get out of the stuck and into the victory stories. That's what we're going
Yes.
for. So I would love to hear your story.
So where should I begin? It's it is a story of a child growing up on the East Coast in a very small Massachusetts, a blue collar town. And, as far back as I can remember, age 7, I was struggling with severe anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. And as we had just talked about, I felt very trapped in a world in which I felt as though I was the only one, in which I felt as though I were broken. And I write about it recently that each day for me felt like this bubbling cauldron of dread. It's the best way that I could describe it. And I would spend most of my waking hours with thoughts spiraling around in my head, intrusive thoughts, unwanted thoughts, that would then lead me to perform rituals and compulsions that so many of us might have heard about, where, for instance, I would have a horrible thought, which I would try to push away, and it would be like a bright, shiny object. It would come back right into the forefront of my mind. And in order to feel some sense of control over that and some comfort in what otherwise was a world of insecurity and not feeling safe, I would have rituals where I would do things in threes. And so I would turn the light switch on and off 3 times. I would check the door handle when I left the house 3 times to make sure it was locked. Those little things were really the only things that I felt as though I had any control over in my life. And that continued through my adolescent years, my high school years, college years, work years, so into my adult life. At the same time, I hid it extremely well. And so while I was struggling, I was always struggling in silence, and I never let anyone know. I joke with people now that I probably could have won an Oscar for the performance that I was playing. Nobody, and I've gone back and I've asked kids and from growing up, friends from growing up, I've asked people from my work life, even my wife, who I met in college at the time, didn't know what was going on with me. It was as though I had learned to play 2 very different characters. One was the character that I wanted to show to the outside world. I was always smiling. I was always joking. Now I know it was very much a defense mechanism. While on the inside, I was struggling. I would have periods of severe anxiety, to the point where it was very difficult to not only leave the house, but sometimes to leave the confines of the couch or my bed, because that's where I felt most safe and most secure. And it took until I was 33 years old. It was 2000. It was the end of the summer in 2004. And I had my first of 2 dissociative episodes, which, call them psychotic breaks, dissociative episode, nervous breakdown, all in that same umbrella, until I finally couldn't hide it anymore. And my wife could completely see what was happening with me. I had to be very, very honest. I knew I couldn't live that way anymore. I knew that I had found myself in a really deep and dark hole that I wasn't able to get out by myself. And so I really opened up and I shared with her what I was experiencing. And with her and through her strength, I was able to find a therapist in New York City. And I began to share with him my story. And from that day on, I'm 52 now. So it's been a 19-year journey that spanned living in Massachusetts, living in New York, and now living in Colorado, where I've gone on that healing journey, and it's had twists and it's had turns, and I've grown from it. I've become stronger from it. And I'm happy to be able to say that I'm here today as someone who has experienced some very high highs and some very, very low lows, but that I'm living proof that no matter how low those lows get, there is a way through. There's hope, there's help, and you too are not alone.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. And as you share your story, and all of our stories are a little different, and they all have common threads. And some of the things that were common is that ability and desire to present to the world a face that I am okay. I'm fine. I'm doing great. That's the way that we want people to perceive us, even when, and maybe even especially when that's not what we feel on the inside. And I loved your description. You could win an Oscar award. And I've talked to other people where I did not know what was going on because the face that they presented was so good. And I've had people tell me, wow, I had no idea what you were going through because the face that you put on was so, pleasant. I'm great. I'm doing great when I was dying inside. So I understand that desire. I understand that facade, that creating that external, just that face that we want people to see. And it's interesting that we can be very, very good at it. And yet the healing does not come until we're able to peel off that mask, get rid of that facade, and allow ourselves and someone that we trust be able to see the real thing. And I think we hide it from ourselves as well
Oh,
as hiding it from others.
we absolutely do. And I was just talking about this a couple of days ago, and it was a memory that came back uh, just based on a conversation I was having. And I even, I was even hiding it without knowing it in the first few months that I was seeing my therapist way back in 2004. And I remember I was in his office one morning. I would always meet him 7 a.m. in the morning before I had to be in my office. And I think I hinted Colin and I, a guest on your show, Colin Kingsmill, and a friend of mine, had very similar backgrounds. So I was an investment banker for 18 years. And I remember, sitting there dressed in my suit and my Wall Street costume, as I used to call it. And my therapist at one point looked at me, and he was this really sweet old man in his 80s, and I loved him dearly. And he said, Eric, I have a question for you. And I said, sure, Dr. K, what? And he goes, so you're coming in to see me, and you come in here. At this point, I was seeing him twice a week, down from 3. So that was a big success in my life. And he said, one of the things I notice is every time you come in here, you're smiling. And he stopped, and I didn't say anything. And I said, really? He goes, yes. He goes, I find it really interesting that you're coming in here and you're struggling and you're here for help. But every time we have a discussion, you're always smiling. What is that all about? And it caught me completely off guard. And I didn't really understand what the whole point was. It took me a little bit of time after I left that day to think about it. And then I realized, wait a second, like this smile, and we had a long discussion about it in a future session. This smile was what I had been hiding behind. And I wasn't even being open and honest with him. And I started to think about some of the things that I was holding back and things that I really needed to say to him and get some clarity on, that I was afraid to let come out of my mouth. And as you said, after I really uncovered that and we had that discussion and I started to think about how I was presenting myself to the world, then some real healing started for me, because I started to really tell the deep, dark parts of my story that even I was afraid to let out into a public forum.
Absolutely. And it's a defense mechanism to sometimes to laugh it off. I had a horrible experience. Oh, just laugh it off. That was no big deal. And it's interesting. We want to be authentic. We want to have the outside and the inside match. But when we're all said and done, I would like my outside to be smiling and my inside to be smiling. I don't want to just say, oh, well, I'm miserable. Forget this trying to be happy thing anymore. Let's just be miserable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think being authentic is absolutely necessary. We need to become self-aware, and we need to be honest, and we need to be vulnerable. And I would like, when I become my authentic self and have the inside and the outside match, that they're both happy and not both miserable.
Yes. And you brought up two words that I love and are such important words in my vocabulary, and it's authenticity and vulnerability. And I don't think you can have a conversation with one word and without the other, because in order to be your true authentic self, you have to be able to be vulnerable. And I do some work here in our valley in Colorado, facilitating a men's group. And one of the amazing things that I've seen in this group of men that comes together once a month is how they're able to become vulnerable with each other and share things with each other, which are often thought as stigma and as taboo. Men don't share their feelings, men don't cry, men can't be vulnerable. And it's so amazing to me to sit with people and hear their vulnerable moments, because that's when I know they truly are being authentic and real. And that's when you can relate to somebody else and you can relate to their story, is when you really break down the walls and you get to know somebody on that real authentic level. And for me, it's been incredibly healing as well to discover that there are people within my own community who are struggling with some of the same feelings and some of the same issues. We might, as you said, no two stories are the same. They're like fingerprints. Each one is unique, but there are common threads that run through them. And to be able to have those authentic, vulnerable conversations is so, so powerful. And it's important in building that community of like-minded people who are looking to take these journeys and heal together.
And that is so huge. And you have to have a safe space. And I love, as you're talking about these experiences, I just want to bring up the point that it is a men's group. And sometimes, I mean, we all have feelings, we all have emotions, we all have challenges, we all have experiences, we all have fears and hopes and dreams. But for some reason, it is a common, I guess, another stigma, another expectation that sometimes men feel like, that sounds funny, feel like they're not allowed to have feelings. It's like, no, we don't have those. In fact, if you have any, you're allowed to have two. And those are anger and lust. Those are the only two that are allowed. Anything else is not manly. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so it is easier to deal with physical pain than it is to deal with emotional pain. And I don't know all of the reasons why that is. Part of it is we feel weak if we're not in control. We feel, I don't know. So I would love some more
Yeah.
insight.
Oh,
Let's talk
sure.
about men. Let's talk about men being allowed. First of all,
Yes.
is it okay if we acknowledge you're a man, right?
Yes.
Are you allowed? Do you have feelings?
I absolutely do.
Okay, good to know. Okay, so
Each
men
each and every
do
day.
have feelings. Okay, is that okay? Are you allowed to have those?
So based on society's definition of a man, the old stigma, no. The reality of being a human being on this earth, absolutely. And that's, with all of the work I do, It all comes back to shattering stigmas. And one of these stigmas is exactly how you described it, that men, and if you listen to the typical male conversation, it usually takes place at the end of a day, sometimes at a bar, some other location, and the conversation usually centers around sports teams, something that happened during the day at work, as you said, that caused anger, right? And in many ways, the anger and the victimhood. And the other is around, some sex conversation, wherever direction that goes in. And men have often felt like that's their lane. And the reality with men is, as brought up, we're brought up as problem solvers. And as a problem solver, in and of itself, men believe that whatever is going on in our lives, we can fix it. We don't need to tell somebody else. We can fix it on our own. We, just like, in my world of being a banker, A plus B equals C. Doesn't equal D, doesn't equal E. That equation always adds up. In the real world, it doesn't. And that's where we get into trouble as men, is if we're trying to solve all of our problems on our own. And one of the unfortunate things is, when you look at, especially some of these mountain towns, and I know you're in Utah and I'm here in Colorado, and the suicide belt that runs from New Mexico up to Canada, and the rate of suicide is much higher in this part of the country, and it's also much higher among men. And the reason is, men often feel, as I said, they are problem solvers, and rather than open up and be vulnerable and talk to somebody else. And it's very important. I want to get this message out now, especially around the holidays, and as the weather changes and we can often feel a bit isolated. Rather than finding somebody else to reach out to, somebody that we can talk to, somebody that we can be vulnerable with, men think, well, if I can't solve the problem, therefore I am a failure. And because I am a failure, I am going to take blank action. Right. And unfortunately, that action will often be taking one's own life, feeling as though that is easier and will allow the pain to go away, and rather than be vulnerable. And I'm here to say that it may feel as though being vulnerable and opening up might be difficult the first time you do it. From that point on, it gets so much easier. The conversations get easier. The people you will find yourself surrounded with will often be people just like you, who have their own feelings and their own emotions. And that community grows, and that community of men will grow. And so if you're listening to this show today and you feel as though there is no hope, you don't have someone to talk to, and you're not comfortable being vulnerable, reach out to someone, to anyone. I promise you, it gets better from there.
Wow. And that makes such a difference. So I would love to go through that steps just a little bit.
Sure.
We want to be seen as capable and competent. And for men, that often includes, I am a problem solver and I'm strong. And when we feel like I'm not as strong as I want to be, I haven't solved these problems, I wonder if we can kind of twist that thought around in our mind of saying, this is not weakness. This is a new problem that I can solve, and I can bring in people to help me solve it. And when I'm doing hard things, because we mentioned earlier that feeling hard emotions and dealing with painful emotions is harder than dealing with physical things. So that means if I am addressing and dealing with and admitting to these emotional problems, that means I'm strong. not that I'm weak. It means I am strong. And I think that that would be very helpful if we could feel that way, that I'm doing something hard. And when I'm doing something hard, it makes me stronger. And the cool thing is, you said, and as we talk, it becomes easier. It can feel like you're carrying the entire world on your shoulders and it's heavy. And when we can set that down, oh my gosh, we feel so light. This is amazing. You mean I don't have to carry the whole world? I don't have to hide everything. I don't have to pretend that I'm perfect and that I have all the answers. It's okay that I'm working toward a solution like everybody else is. Wow, that is liberating.
So liberating. And I'll bring up an analogy. I'll use one of my favorite sports growing up and to watch now as an adult, and it's baseball. And it's no coincidence that in the sport of baseball, there's a team. There are 9 players on the field. No one player can go out there by himself and play all 9 positions. And it's the same thing when it comes to our mental health. You need to have a team of people around you, a community of people around you that you can lean on and that can lean on you in order for all of you to get stronger. It's just like baseball has spring training, people get together, you get back into the swing of things, you play a 162 game season with the hopes of getting to the playoffs and winning the World Series. Well, it all starts in February in Florida or Arizona, and it moves all the way through now until November. And that team is together from day one through day 178, I believe, if you sweep all the playoffs. It's not a coincidence. And I like to talk often about vulnerability not being a weakness, but rather vulnerability being a strength. And if we look at, as you said, Linda, vulnerability being a strength, like anything else, the more you become vulnerable and the more times you become vulnerable, the stronger you get. And the stronger you get, the easier it is to share stories, the easier it is to be there for other people who may be struggling so that you can then not solve that problem for them, but listen to what they're experiencing and be able to empathize and be able to share in that experience so that they too can find a path to healing.
Okay, that's awesome. And as you brought up the I want to solve the problems, how do we work with that so that we can, because we talked about it a couple times. One is I'm a problem solver, and if I can't solve my problems, I just don't want to play the game. And if someone comes to me with a problem, I am supposed to have the answer. That's why they came to me, obviously. And so this is the go-to. How can I work with this rather than fighting? I don't want to chuck it and say, well, I'm not a problem solver because problem solving is useless, because it's not. How do I work with this natural tendency?
So I think one of the things, and just using that very term problem solver, it doesn't mean problem answerer. It doesn't mean that we have to answer, that there's always a right answer and that we always have the right answer. More often than not, people are looking to be heard and to be seen. And what I've experienced in my advocacy work is when people share their struggles with somebody else, and the person across the table from them is looking at every point to either interject or come up with an answer or try to solve what that person's going through, I can watch that person on the other side start to withdraw and start to shut down. And that's that's one of the things I think that often holds people back from wanting to share with other people, is this feeling of, if I'm going to get vulnerable and I'm going to talk about some of the things that are really I'm struggling with at my core, I want to make sure that the other person is truly listening and listening with their ears. And I'm not looking for an answer. I'm just looking to be heard. And it's so important within mental health. And that's why we have professionals, and it's the job of professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, to be able to not always give that answer, but there, they're there to be able to help put a frame around things and help us think in a better way and help guide us toward an answer. When it comes to the non-professionals, all we can do and all we should be expected to be able to do is to listen and to empathize and to then maybe share parts of our own lived experience. So the person opening up to us says, hey, I'm not alone. I feel comforted knowing that other people out there are going through something I am. And that bond is created. And that's what's so very important.
Love it. Okay, so I'm a problem solver. And now, as I'm opening up my awareness and understanding of how to solve problems, not just to answer them, I can help recognize that when you talk to me, you're not looking for me to solve the problem. The thing that you need is to be heard. So that is the problem that I'm solving when I listen. I did it. I did it. I solved the problem. I heard you. I saw you. Okay. And now the next step that I can do as a problem solver is to say, wow, that sounds familiar. I've gone through things like that too. And then I've solved this problem of someone needs to be seen. They need to be heard, and they need to know that they're not alone. I think we put these things together, that can help satisfy some of the problem solver in me, if that's what I'm trying to soothe.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think, around, we're talking about the holidays and it being Thanksgiving tomorrow, and then Christmas comes up, and often, and people might be separated from family, whether it's because of distance or because there's been some sort of reason, right, for a separation, or family members, loved ones may no longer be with us. And people may be struggling and may not know how to verbalize it or to whom to verbalize it. And so during this time of year, it's important, reach out to your friends, reach out to your neighbors, invite them over, whether it's just, to share a cup of coffee, or if you're one of these people that loves to have, a big gathering at your house, invite somebody over, and you'll be amazed at what that person might share with you. And rather than that person struggling in silence or feeling like they're not part of a community, or as we were talking about earlier, sitting at home and trying to solve the problem. Why am I feeling this way? If we give them some healthy outlets and we give them a feeling of you belong, you're one of us, you're just like us, it'll make that person feel so much better. And we can save lives in the process. And that's what it's all about.
Wow. And as we're talking about problem solving, that's a big one. That is so important, that people stay alive, that they want to stay alive, that they have that hope to keep going. Is it okay? Can I hear your equilateral triangle?
Can you? You absolutely can. So the equilateral triangle of healing, how this came about is about 2 years ago. I was in a really dark place, and I was working with my therapist. I had just been diagnosed with childhood emotional PTSD. And it was a diagnosis which, I ended up with at 50, changed my life for the better, because it was the first time where I could look at myself and say, you have a thing. It's not just symptoms, and we were treating symptoms for a very long time, but you actually do have a thing. And with that thing, just like any other type of physical illness, symptoms come with that, and the symptoms can then be treated. And so I started looking at it from a completely different perspective. Also, what I did is I dove in, head first into the deep end, and I said, this time is going to be much different. I am going to look at all of the different avenues that will allow me to heal on this journey. And so I had heard so many people talk about the toolbox, and people have their toolbox. And when you're struggling with something, they reach into the toolbox and pull out whatever that tool is and use it. And then you put it back. And I thought, that's great and all, but maybe it's not just one tool at a time. Maybe we need different tools to be able to use. And I started thinking about, for me, it was three very different aspects. And so I thought, well, it's kind of like a triangle, and it's like an equilateral triangle where all sides are equal and all angles are equal. No one side or angle is more important than the other, but they're all equally important, because if we take and we pull out one side of that triangle, the whole triangle collapses. And so the equilateral triangle is based on three different points. One is what I call the traditional Western. So for me, it's having my psychologist and psychiatrist and medication that allows me to, get up and go through each and every day and be happy and joyful. And then there's what I call the Eastern corner. And that Eastern corner, which was new for me back 2 years ago, included meditation and mindfulness and Reiki, which I absolutely fell in love with. And I noticed that some of the things that I was experiencing during my Reiki sessions, I was then able to meet with my Western therapist and explain in a much different, clearer, and more concise way. And in fact, I actually was pretty unorthodox and put my therapist in touch with my energy healer and said, I grant both of you permission to speak with each other openly and kind of share what is going on. And that way, if you both have insights and you'll be able to share them with me in a different way, it was super helpful. And the third corner is nature. And it's the whole reason that my wife and I moved here to Colorado 12 years ago, is I found such healing in nature. And we talked before we came on, Linda, for me, skiing is more than just a passion. It's a real part of my life. And I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to teach skiing here in Snowmass for 12 seasons. And so I got to spend each and every day of the winter outside in this incredibly beautiful Rocky Mountain environment, in the fresh air, in the trees, where I really, for the first time in my life, had to be in the present. I couldn't be in the past where depression lives. I couldn't be in the future where anxiety lives. I had to be present on the snow, on my skis, each and every turn. And it allowed my mind to really start to quiet down and appreciate those moments that I was having. And so for me, it's skiing in the wintertime, downhill skiing, cross-country Nordic skiing, and then in the summer and spring and fall, it's mountain biking. And it allows me for a couple of hours each day to be able to go out and be present with my surrounding and not worry about what's going to happen later that afternoon, or what I might have said that may have possibly offended somebody 2 days ago and dwelling on that, but rather pedaling or skiing and just being there in the moment. And so that's where the equilateral triangle of healing came about. And I love how, for me, it feels like this 3-dimensional healing tool, as opposed to just like a box where take out the hammer the nail, put the hammer back, use the screwdriver tomorrow. But it's this, I'm using different pieces and parts each and every day in different amounts for what I need at that particular time.
I love that. What a fun way to think outside the box. You're thinking outside the triangle.
Yes, completely outside the box, not even using the box.
That is awesome. Erik, this has been delightful. Is there anything you want to make sure that we cover before we close today?
So I just want to say to your audience, Linda, that who's listening today, just remember you matter. You're important. There is hope. There's help, and there's a way through. And both Linda and I are here on this podcast today as living proof that each of us has within us the strength to be able to move through even our most difficult times. And just know there are people out there who are willing to sit and are willing to listen. So please find the strength to be able to share your story with someone. It will get better, I promise.
It was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
In closing, I'd like to share a quote by Sigmund Freud. He said, "Out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength." Today, I invite our listeners to allow their vulnerabilities to become strengths. See you next time on Linda's Corner.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Linda's Corner, please share and subscribe to help us reach new listeners. I also invite you to check out my nonprofit, Hope for Healing, at the website hopeforhealingfoundation.org for free ebooks and other free resources to help increase happiness, build confidence and self-esteem, strengthen relationships, manage stress, and calm feelings of depression and anxiety. I also invite you to grab a copy of one of my books, like Crushed, A Journey Through Depression, or Amazon bestseller, You Got This, an action plan to calm fear, anxiety, worry, and stress. See you next time on Linda's Corner.